Today, I'm excited to welcome Lee to the podcast. Lee is a Bitcoin advocate, technologist, and futurist. Welcome to the Bitcoin Edge, Lee.
Thanks for having me, Paula. Glad to be here.
Well, it's really good to have you. I wanted to hear a little bit about your background before we get to Bitcoin.
Yeah, of course. So I am the technologist part of my background is I've been in corporate information technology roles for over 25 years at varying sizes of companies and based out of the Midwest here in the United States. So I really grew up doing doing IT support, kind of starting out on the phones, supporting end users directly to fixing PCs and printers to working on servers and more data center based technologies and cloud, and kind of worked my way up over the years to kind of leadership positions doing IT. And yeah, it's been quite a journey, and it's been remarkable to kind of watch things from Microsoft Windows 3.1 back in the 90s and kind of internet first coming out and having it be all text based to now I've got the world on my on my phone with chat gpt, the internet. I've been fortunate to have a front row seat for all of it.
And did that kind of lead you to Bitcoin?
It's funny, I was thinking about that prior to this interview, and no, it didn't for me. I think for some people it does. I think some people that have had maybe a cybersecurity background or have worked on cryptography and some of those more technical aspects of Bitcoin, I feel like it's very easy for them to grok it. I think for others that come through maybe more of the Austrian economics or hard money kind of backgrounds, if they had a background as a gold bug, that's easy for them. For me, as a technologist focusing on kind of end user facing technologies like mobile devices, things like that, I just wasn't thinking about it. And even though I obviously could feel and see like the effects of having a broken money, of constant inflation and houses always going up, you just accept that as a fact of life. It just didn't occur to me. I think at some point in the 20 teens, I remember hearing about Bitcoin, whether it was on TV or or from coworkers that I worked with, and I just kind of thought that sounds Looney Tunes. Like that can't that doesn't seem like that's worth anything. It probably won't last. And maybe back then it was in the hundreds of dollars. The first time I actually bought Bitcoin, maybe this is a journey many are familiar with, during the pandemic in 2021. I started hearing on Twitter, all of back then Twitter before it was X, hearing about these people talking about Dogecoin and these things that are just flying up in value, and the GameStop trade and all these things that are going up. And so with Dogecoin specifically, I'm like, how do I get it? And I was asking people, and they said, yeah, you got to sign up on Binance. I'm like, what's Binance? Like, what is so I think I eventually went on Coinbase and bought my first Bitcoin in 2021, but only foolishly to trade for, a meme coin. And, they couldn't even KYC. Once I tried to move that to Binance, I didn't even get KYC'd fast enough before the bubble burst on it. And then I just forgot about it. I kind of forgot about my Bitcoin. And then I was asked to come and put together a class on emerging technologies for undergraduates for the business school that I went to. And I thought, okay, this is finally a chance for me to figure out what this blockchain thing is all about. The class was all about building an understanding for business students on 10 different emerging technologies. And so blockchain was one of those. And so I started looking at Bitcoin again. I'm like, oh, this is interesting. Okay. Oh, there's all these other blockchain. And then, of course, went down again the altcoin rabbit hole. And then about a year ago, I finally said, let me take another look at Bitcoin really seriously. Because I was thinking in my mind, oh yeah, I remember it was about $15,000 back after FTX blew up. And I thought, okay, which was a big exchange in 2022 that went under during the bear market. And I look at it and I said, oh, it's not 15,000 now, it's $20,000. And then I was on a business trip flying out to New England. And I saw while I was on the plane, it went up $5,000 in the span of a 2-hour trip. And I said, what is this thing? So then finally I got my hands on the What is Money podcast. So I didn't go the easy route. Like many people just read the Bitcoin Standard. I didn't know that existed. I heard about the What is Money podcast. I just was looking for anything with Bitcoin in it. And by Robert Breedlove. And of course, he opened up the podcast saying, oh, if you're just new here, go back to episode 1 and listen to the Sailor series. What's the Sailor series? There ensued 20 plus hours of podcast materials of the great Michael Saylor, chairman of MicroStrategy, and Robert Breedlove. And then I was completely orange pilled. I started getting rid of all my altcoins. I still had Ethereum and other things. Went all in on Bitcoin, started cold storage Bitcoin. The rest is kind of history.
Wow. So that's kind of cool. Once you listened to those podcasts and learned more about Bitcoin, did you kind of just know that altcoins were not the way to go?
Yes. And I think there's one other piece of the story that I didn't mention, which is before I went down the Saylor Breedlove rabbit hole, I had a colleague of mine, very technical colleague, who always talked about Bitcoin and Ethereum. And he said, hey, I put this class together. He was kind of experimenting on trying to teach. And so he said, would you look at it and give me some feedback? And so, a year prior, and I'd started, and then I kind of gave up on it. So then after that plane ride and to New England, I said, where's that video? Where's that guy's series? Let me watch that. And it went through all of the technical aspects of how Bitcoin operates, how proof of work, like why proof of work is so critical, like why it's so critical to take real energy from the physical world in order to constrain a digital asset to create true digital scarcity. And that, I think, was really the appeal. Then getting into the Saylor series with Breedlove was more the philosophical and kind of the history of money and the history of human civilization and progress and so on. That really kind of got me hooked. But I think it was understanding truly those technical aspects and saying, well, proof of stake actually doesn't make any sense. You can't really provide scarcity with a proof of stake type of a network. They're all centralized, they're all kind of run by a foundation, right? A nonprofit foundation, but they all are controlled. And I love what Michael Saylor says about Bitcoin. Satoshi made a way, he gave it away, and he went away. And that's unique to like any of these other projects. So that's what hooked.
Yeah, because even if these other projects did use the proof of work protocol, there would still be a leader.
Exactly. I mean, even like the Caspa network, right, is another one out there that they all claim to be the next Bitcoin, right? And they're claiming that as well and use proof of work. But Bitcoin's really the 0 to 1 innovation, right? That's really the beginning. That's where all of the liquidity is going. That's where you're seeing, even prior to this new administration in the US, now the Trump administration having won the recent elections in the US, when we still had a fairly antagonistic administration, we still got clarity from a regulatory perspective with the Bitcoin spot ETF approval in January of this year. And so knowing that was coming, and then predicting it and telling everybody, and everyone saying it's not going to happen, and then it did happen, also helped to kind of cement for me, like, no, this thing really has staying power. It's really going to be unique against any of these other assets, these copycats. This is really where the gravity is going to be. It was at the time maybe a sub $1 trillion asset. Now it's almost a $1.5 trillion asset and growing.
Yeah, and since you mentioned the new administration, how do you think that is going to change things for Bitcoin?
I think it's going to change. It's hard to tell exactly, but some things were already in motion. Obviously, once we had the spot Bitcoin ETFs, you had some regulatory clarity that gives institutional investors, and even in some cases, sovereign investors, so government investors, such as pension funds. A couple of pension funds have started to put Bitcoin on their balance sheet in the US. So that was one step of clarity. But you still had, an SEC, a Securities and Exchange Commission, that was very antagonistic, I would say, certainly to broader crypto for sure, but even to Bitcoin, very selective in who they would allow to play, right? So the ETF issuers, the 11 ETF issuers, they got permission to play, but banks couldn't custody Bitcoin. And one of the key elements that will move this into an institutional grade asset is banks being able to custody Bitcoin. So if you're an institutional investor or high net worth, ultra high net worth individual, you're used to just picking up the phone and calling Morgan Stanley or JP Morgan or whatever your bank is and saying, hey, I need, this asset or that asset or what have you. And we'll talk in a quarter, right? We'll talk, at our next rebalance. And with Bitcoin, they're going to say, well, I'm not going to go to Coinbase or River or, sign up for an account. And maybe the ETF, they're really not sure about that either. But the SEC allowed BNY Mellon. They gave them an exception from some of their rulemaking and said, hey, they can custody Bitcoin for institutional customers. But that's like picking winners and losers. I think with this new administration, you're going to see a much more Bitcoin and crypto friendly administration. And so I think we'll be able to remove some of those restrictions and stop picking winners and losers and be more from everything I'm hearing from President-elect Trump and others in his orbit, like Vivek or RFK, all kind of Bitcoin. Obviously, as Vice President elect JD Vance, who owns Bitcoin, that all of them are going to want the U.S. to be a winner in Bitcoin, not just my certain friends on Wall Street or my friends in New York. Let's have the United States and our citizens and our businesses become winners, and I think that's what we'll see.
It'll be interesting to see if they start building a strategic reserve.
The strategic reserve is a very, very interesting concept. I was my wife and I attended the Bitcoin conference in Nashville to try to learn more as I was getting more into this space. And on Twitter, I think that was really the rumor mill, right? Is that there would be an announcement of a strategic reserve, and I was honestly somewhat skeptical. I thought, we'll see. And of course, even Trump getting on stage, I think it was like an hour delayed from when he was supposed to talk. So just the anticipation is through the roof. And then he did manage to say Bitcoin strategic stockpile, I think he called it. But right after he got off stage, Senator Cynthia Lummis from Wyoming, who's been a huge Bitcoin advocate in Washington, D.C., had the bill in her hands, saying this is it, Bitcoin strategic reserve, whatever, get to 1 million Bitcoin, and lays out all of the custody procedures and how long we have to wait before we sell any of it, all of these things. So I think that's really interesting, and the fact that not to get into politics, but I mean the fact that the same administration's party will have control over the House and the Senate as well. It seems to me to suggest that they're going to have good odds at getting a strategic reserve passed, and then that's really changing the game. Because even if there's movement towards that, sovereign wealth funds, other governments, they're all going to be looking at that and saying, well, wait a minute, there's only 21 million that'll ever exist of Bitcoin. And already Satoshi has 1 million, right? The Bitcoin spot ETFs are gobbling up another million. Michael Saylor, has 1% of the network at 250 some odd thousand. Now he's announced a $42 billion capital plan to go after more Bitcoin. There won't be much left for China and BRICS and all these other countries. So I think it's going to kick off a bit of an arms race, a peaceful arms race, to get your fair share of the Bitcoin as quickly as you can for your nation. And what does that do to price when you have unlimited demand and a finite asset?
Yeah, that will be wonderful if it can remain peaceful. And also, we are a debt-based system, which means that we print money because we have to. Our debt is a little bit high, but obviously on this new system, we may print less money. And like you said, there's also going to be a big demand for Bitcoin. Is that how you see it going? So the US dollar will remain quite strong, but the demand for Bitcoin will continue.
For sure, I expect that the demand for Bitcoin will continue. I need to give more thought to what some people have called a Bitcoin dollar that could exist, right? So as you described, there's very much we're in this fiat world really ever since 1913, creation of the Federal Reserve in the U.S., but we still kind of are on this quasi gold standard. Then FDR in 1933 made it illegal to own gold, but foreign governments could still reclaim their gold from the U.S. And then, of course, 1971, Nixon kind of shut the gold window and put us on a full fiat standard. And so then the government and why would they do that, right? It's all about having the flexibility to print money so that I don't have to tax the citizenry to wage my wars or favor this group or that group. I can just go to the money printer and run deficits, and it'll just happen. So the question I think that you bring up is one I think we have to spend a lot of time thinking about, and policymakers need to think about, which is, well, what could a Bitcoin dollar look like? Like today we have the petrodollar, right, since 1971, where pretty much we make all of oil purchases in global markets running with US dollars, right, and really insist that sellers of oil buy our treasuries as a result of the money that they take in. And of course, they're already rebelling against that. We see that with the BRICS countries and others starting to move away from that. But what would it be like if the U.S. said, well, we're going to try to go back to a more fixed money or hard money standard, but rather than gold, let's go to digital gold, right? Let's go to Bitcoin, start putting that into our reserves, and then somehow pegging that to the dollar. Like, what would that look like? I think it would be a very disruptive change because of course we've been so used to the ability that governments can just say, oh, well, we'll just, send 50 billion to Ukraine to keep that war going. And, oh, we'll buy up all these vaccines and we'll pay big pharma companies, for that, won't ask how much, but we'll just, write the check because, we don't have to worry about it. Right. We'll just run deficits and US sovereign debt is very, very popular around the world. So we'll be fine. Well, we're fine until it's not popular anymore, until countries stop buying our sovereign debt, and then the Federal Reserve has to buy it. So I think it could be interesting to see how it would constrain our spending, but that's going to be a really big culture shock in Washington. And so I'm not convinced we'll be able to make that leap. Maybe we can, but I think the fact that we're trying to trend toward that direction is positive. I think that's very positive.
Yeah, you bring up some really good points there. You brought up the Federal Reserve, and you and I were talking. You just read The Creature from Jekyll Island. I'm
Mm.
still reading it. Tell me what tell me what were some of your biggest lessons?
Huh. It's a book I probably need to read, many more times. The first thing that is, it's a bit of a tongue in cheek, and I posted it on X the other day, actually yesterday. But the first two things you need to understand about the Federal Reserve is that one, it's not federal, and two, it has no reserves. um, it's interesting to me that it's actually this kind of cartel like if the book is to be believed, and that its foundation in prior to 1933, before it was enacted, is that it's really this kind of lender of last resort cartel, and that there's a desire to make it seem like a government entity, make the building of marble, have this seal that's on our fiat currencies that looks very, very official. It's signed off by the Treasury Secretary as well, so it looks very very official, but it's a separate entity. It's a separate private entity. That's the first takeaway that I was kind of surprised to really see. One of the other takeaways that I was surprised to see is that it's not the first attempt to create a central bank in the US. That there had been, I don't remember right off the top of my head, but several, like 2 or 3 other attempts that had failed to try to get a central bank stood up. So there was a strong desire in the banking sector to create this lender of last resort with control of the currency, and so forth. And so I thought that was an interesting bit of history. And I guess I would say that the third is that with all of these institutions, the Federal Reserve, the IMF, the World Bank, that become kind of these supranational institutions, and that there's this desire to kind of, by I would say, people that are more globally minded in terms of, like, we would call them globalists, right? That really have a view of not really promoting the sovereignty necessarily of individual nations, but really trying to have this broader world kind of government, right? And you see that in like Davos, Switzerland, with the World Economic Forum, and that happens every winter, and that's kind of that they're moving more towards that desire of empowering and strengthening those supra governmental organizations, like all the central banks. They're all working together, kind of whether with or against their own citizens, and then the IMF and World Bank, etc. So that was another thing I was kind of like, wow, like, do people really understand that? Is that good for our own nation? We should have that frank dialogue. I think our citizens should have that, first get educated and understand it. But what really is happening is that they're not educated about these things. I tend to find only people that have studied, Murray Rothbard, or Ludwig von Mises, or other Austrian economists. Only they kind of question and raise their hand and say, wait a minute, is this the direction that America or other countries should go? But because people aren't educated, they're not even able to ask the question. So I think reading something like The Creature from Jekyll Island and just get educated so that you can make an informed decision, I think everyone should read that book. It should be required reading for sure.
Yes, I agree. And on that note, if that is true, that these very wealthy families are behind the Federal Reserve, then they are going to want to have a say in
Hmm.
how we use money going forward. And that's why Bitcoin is always something that we can have in our own self custody to not only hedge against inflation, but also just to have something outside of the system.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And it brings me to another, it's interesting. I wasn't a reader until I fell down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, and now I have many books that I've read, since I've been on this journey, including the Bitcoin Standard. I did finally get to read that, and I said, "Oh, I wish I'd read this earlier. This was like this would have saved me 50 hours of time." But anyway. No, I think what's interesting is, so another book I read was The Sovereign Individual, right? And that's exactly what it's talking about, that the value that you get from a government that basically controls you through force, right? Because they if you don't pay your taxes, they'll take your house away or what have you, right? So they are kind of governing you by force, and you pay for that security through obviously through your taxes. And of course, in addition to that, they print money as is needed. But that's your payment in. And sovereign individuals are going to want their own sovereignty. They're going to need their own money. So of course, it was interesting. Sovereign Individual was written in 1997, well before Bitcoin, and it even predicted that there would be a cyber money, right, that would be outside of the control of the governments or of central banks, and that would enable that sovereign individual thesis to thrive. To bring it back to modern times, I think about, and again, maybe to bring up altcoins, this is why I don't like the altcoin projects, because they're really just a perpetuation of exactly what you're talking about, this centrally controlled money. Well, instead of it being a government controlling the money, is it better that I just have some private citizen in control of the money instead? No, not at all. If we go back to the Terra Luna collapse in May of 2022, or the FTX collapse, right, in November of 2022, if you take your trust and you give that to someone else to manage, to own, kind of owning your currency or your money, you don't know what they're doing with it. You don't know if they've rehypothecated. You have no idea. So people that are going to become potentially sovereign individuals, they need a sovereign money. They need them. They need a commodity without an issuer, right? Like gold. You've got to have something like that nobody can print, can stop, can copy, can debase. You need something that it is truly without an issuer. And Bitcoin is the first time in history that we've truly had something, an asset without an issuer, that's truly verifiably scarce, right, and finite, and no one can take it from you. If I have my hardware wallet, or if I have my 12-word seed phrase memorized in my head, I can go anywhere in the world with $1 billion, right? And you can't do that with with anything else. Even with my altcoins, there was an altcoin project. I won't go into detail, but there was an altcoin project that I had invested in prior to becoming a Bitcoiner. And it there was some debate about how the coins for this project were initially put into the ecosystem. And so some people said, "Hey, this person they cheated. Right? They somehow cheated this the starting of the blockchain." And so there was a proposal, a vote, to say, should we take this person's coins and put them into some address? And it's that's true straight democracy. And they voted yes to confiscate this person's coins. And they did. They took them away from this person. And I watched that kind of in horror, and said, so even a private citizen, a private money has risks. So really, Bitcoin is the only one where there's no counterparty risk. I took on tremendous counterparty risk with that coin. So,
That's true. And they can also print more, right? There's a lot of issuance, and I know there's some that are better than others, but they can continue to issue more coins, whereas Bitcoin, we only have 21 million.
yeah, this is when I taught. So I used to teach emerging technologies, I think I mentioned earlier, and one of the things, it was funny, when I first started teaching the course, I was very, very open, right, to different projects. But as I grew in my understanding of Bitcoin, I wouldn't denigrate them, right? Like sometimes I see Bitcoiners, and I've actually asked this question on X. I see them constantly showing the ETH BTC ratio and the value of Ethereum against BTC, like going lower and lower and lower. And I'm kind of like, let's leave them alone. So the way I talked about it with my students is, I would say you have Bitcoin, which is this verifiably scarce hard money, right? The asset without an issuer. And then you have all of these crypto projects. This is my kind of Bitcoin versus crypto thesis. All these other projects are like software startups. Just think about them as software startups like in Silicon Valley that are just bootstrapping, but instead of using VC money, they're issuing, VCs are involved actually in a lot of these projects, but they're bootstrapping with creating their own token, right, out of thin air. That sounds similar, right? Sounds like fiat. And then and doing whatever they want to do. So, okay, if you know that's what you're going into, if you're interested in just being a part of like a community or what have you, great. But if you're really looking for like a money where you're going to actually like store your wealth for 100 or 1,000 years, are you going to store that on a proof of stake startup that, one development team has full control? I don't think so.
Exactly. And while you were talking, I was also thinking of, people in other countries. In Africa, I interviewed quite a few people in Zambia,
Mm.
Kenya, Zimbabwe, and then, of course, South America too. And they have much higher inflation than us, and they really need Bitcoin. So there's lots of reasons for it.
Yeah, coming to learn about countries like Argentina, where they've had double and triple digit inflation, and it's finally taken to bringing in a firebrand like Javier Milei to start to change some of that. But I try to put myself in the shoes of an average Argentinian, or Peter McCormack, just an amazing podcaster who ran the What Bitcoin Did podcast and now Mr. Obnoxious. Like, he had gone to Malawi with, I think, Jeff Booth and Alex Gladstein from the Human Rights Foundation, and described like overnight, the currency in Malawi debased by 44%. Nobody had a say in it. Just one day, you go to the market, everything's up, and you have no idea in what you still have the same currency in your hand. What do you do? That's so unjust. That's the part of fiat that really pulls, as a Christian and as a believer in justice, right? That is an injustice. Like, that is a currency that is unjust. It's not fair to the farmer who's trying to just sell their goods, and then all of a sudden, people are expecting, all of their input costs go up, but yet, their customers maybe can't afford it anymore. It's not fair to the mother that goes to the market and is ready to buy, milk and eggs, and all of a sudden they've all gone up 50%. That's such an unjust system. That's an unjust kind of money to operate with. And Bitcoin is just such perfect, justice and fairness, right? All the rules are known up front. It's rules without rulers. I know that there's this much Bitcoin. I know there's this much Bitcoin, introduced 3.125 every block every 10 minutes. I know what to expect. I know it'll be 21 million by 2140. Like, I know what to expect. And with fiat, no idea. A bunch of folks can make some decisions. Yesterday the Federal Reserve lowered our rates 25 basis points. Okay, it's just done. So
You know your facts. I love it. You've done your research.
well, one thing I really find as I've gotten to know Bitcoiners, I've been very fortunate. So I consider myself class of 2023. So I've been really actively a Bitcoiner for 13 months. I've gotten to go to the Bitcoin conference. I've gotten to meet a lot of great Bitcoiners on X, on formerly Twitter, and my local meetups and so on. They're curious. Bitcoiners are curious. They want to learn. They start learning a little bit, and then they want to know more, right? So I think almost everyone I've talked to, they start their journey. They come from Bitcoin for a number go up, right? Like maybe to get rich, or for more philosophical reasons, or in other countries, as we talked about, whether it's Malawi or Argentina or other countries. They're coming for, or like Egypt as well. Egypt too has faced tremendous inflation. They come for necessity. Whatever reason they come, I feel like Bitcoiners then get curious and want to know more, right? They want to know about mining. Like I started getting interested in mining and started investing in mining stocks and learning about how Bitcoin is transforming energy. Like I don't know if you've talked to the folks at Gridless, for example, in Africa, where they're putting in Bitcoin mining containers near sources of hydropower. And it creates this like synergistic setup where the power provider is now incentivized to invest and build a hydropower generator. Gridless now benefits because now they have access to very inexpensive power to power their Bitcoin mining rigs, and of course pay the power bill. And best of all, the villagers benefit because now they have like regular power that prior they didn't have. I had no idea that was something that Bitcoin could contribute to. That Bitcoin could contribute to flourishing in some of these, more poverty-stricken communities that don't have access to power that we just take for granted in the West. And Bitcoin's part of that solution. That's incredible. So I think we get very curious. I think we try to solve lots of interesting problems with Bitcoin. And I think the future is very bright for nations that embrace it and for individuals that embrace it.
I agree. Once I started down this rabbit hole, I realized how much I don't know, and I just keep learning. I learn from every person. I wanted to ask you about being a futurist. Tell us what you mean by that.
So, like many phrases, I think that being a futurist can mean many things to many people. the way I think about it and how I live it out is really trying to understand first the history. So it's funny, when I taught my classes, any subject around emerging technologies, I would always try to go back to history. So for example, when I think ChatGPT actually launched during one of my semesters, and I realized, oh no, next semester I'm going to have to rewrite everything. And so I did, and I took time to go all the way back to World War II and kind of work my way up. So the first thing I think that's very important to be a futurist, maybe counterintuitively, is to know your past, because things have been tried before. Bitcoin's another good example where there's a great poster out there. I'll have to find it and repost it, that shows all of the work that's actually built up to Bitcoin. And it's not just like a few years worth, it's decades worth of people standing on the shoulders of giants, building out different ideas about proof of work and ideas of, about timestamping and all these different things to actually get to Bitcoin. So understanding history is very, very critical. And then being really broad in your thinking about, okay, what's actually out in the world today? So I think it's past and now present. What's out there in the world today? One of the phrases I use in my class is that the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. Think about Bitcoin again, right? If you're a Bitcoiner like us, and you're on X and you're reading and you're really in the know, and I think back to when I knew the ETFs, spot Bitcoin ETFs, were going to get approved. I knew it before anybody, and it's like, this is strange. It feels obvious to me. It feels inevitable to me. And anyone I would talk to, like, yeah, what are those? And so I didn't even know they exist, or they're skeptical that it's actually going to get approved. No, this administration's anti-Bitcoin. It's not going to happen. I said, no, after the Grayscale lawsuit, this is going to happen. So that's, I think, the second thing is like looking around you and understanding what's the current state of play, and then is trying to imagine possible futures, right? One of the tools that I teach in my class is it's by an author named Amy Webb, called the time cone, and it's a way to think about the future in kind of different horizons. So what I would call like our horizon one, try to imagine like how could this technology evolve over the next 1 to 2 years, and then horizon two, start thinking 2 to 5 years out. Well, where could it go even further? What could be possible? I'll get to another tool that we use in a minute, but start thinking about what could be possible in a little bit more of a distant future, and then really stretch your mind 10 years out. What could, just like you're almost thinking like the movie The Fifth Element that came out 20 some years ago. Could that be a future of like flying cars and all of these kinds of things? And then another tool I would use in my class is called design fiction, where you actually try to build a prototype or a storyline, or some other kind of pretend artifact, or as I would call it, kind of archaeology of the future, to try to imagine that future world and actually map it out, create it. And I think the best design fiction that maybe ever came out was the white paper, the Bitcoin white paper, on October 31st, 2008. We just celebrated the 16th anniversary a week ago. And then of course the actual product came not that much longer later. But that's kind of how I think about it. Is you got to be curious, study the past, because the past can always teach you. Know what's happening around you now, because again, the future is already here in some way. Somebody's already thinking about these things. You just haven't heard about it, or it's not in the news. And then dream, get curious and dream, and think about what could be possible, and then try to create that in the world, even if it's a fake prototype. Just try to create it, and then you never know where it might go from there.
That's very true. So, do you have any Bitcoin predictions for us? 5, 10 years, even if it's not price, what are some of your predictions around Bitcoin? Do you see it continuing to evolve?
Well, that's a good. So yeah, I think there's a couple of questions in there. There's a vector of price, right? There's a vector of adoption. How does it continue to adopt? And I think there's another question around the protocol itself. Does the protocol itself go through any further change? This is the great ossification debate, right? Do we need to continue to make changes to Bitcoin, or is it set in stone and we should not change it? So there's a lot of different paths we could go down. Briefly, I would say I expect adoption to really accelerate, because now that you have all of this regulatory clarity, and now you have this pro-Bitcoin administration in the US as the largest economy, I expect that the adoption of individuals that's already kind of been there will accelerate. You have Michael Saylor, the greatest kind of spokesperson for corporate adoption. I think that's going to drive a lot more. You're going to see a lot more companies looking at this, and you've seen companies like Semler Scientific in the US, Metaplanet in Japan that are adopting the MicroStrategy playbook of putting Bitcoin on their balance sheet and doing accretive actions like either issuing bonds or equity to acquire more Bitcoin and lever it up and grow their value and shareholder value. So I think you'll continue to see more of that corporate adoption. And sure enough, again, the future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed. Microsoft, a shareholder of Microsoft, one of the largest companies in the world, has a question, posed to the board on whether they should, assess putting Bitcoin on the balance sheet of the mighty Microsoft. I couldn't even imagine that a year ago. Could you? I mean, there's no way a year ago you could imagine that happening. But yet, on their board vote next month in December, that's going to become a topic. So corporate adoption, definitely. Government adoption, the sovereign adoption is going to continue. You already have the nation of Bhutan, right? That's mining Bitcoin, and I think they have the most Bitcoin per capita, I think, in the world. You'll have to fact check me on that, but you have them, and of course you have El Salvador. That's been an amazing success story. But these are small countries; these are very, very small countries. What if you had the U.S. actually start to do the strategic reserve? If we get serious, what if the BRICS nations, instead of adopting, they're trying to find a way out of being beholden to the U.S. dollar, so they're looking at gold or a basket of fiat currencies, which doesn't really sound like that's going to get them where they want to go. What if they adopt Bitcoin as part of a BRICS currency? So I think government adoption, you're going to see more governments and sovereign wealth funds and those kinds of entities adopt. So I see adoption as continuing to go through the roof. And then when it comes to price, I mean, that's such a risky thing. I'm not sure. I've said some things on X. I don't know how much I want to pin myself down to. There's a lot of interest in different models, right, of stock to flow, which I think kind of broke down during the last bull run. Power law is the hot topic. Now I've taken a stats class, but I'm not quite smart enough to understand, really sharp people like, Fred Krueger and Giovanni and others. I leave those discussions to them. But maybe I'll say it's going up forever, Paula.
That's a good answer, Lee. and everything will continue to fall when priced in Bitcoin, just because of the way our system is set up. It might be slower at times, but long term, everything falls when priced in Bitcoin.
Exactly. I think, I know I've seen the charts. You probably have too out there on X and social media of, maybe 10 years ago, it was 600 Bitcoin to buy the average home. And now it's 6 Bitcoin. I mean, that's for the average person who's maybe not paying attention or doesn't understand maybe some of the intricacies of Bitcoin. I would think that chart right there would be the biggest eye opener. Exactly what you said, Paul, of, that your Bitcoin, what does it ultimately do? Like hard money, a hard asset like Bitcoin preserves your purchasing power. I mean, even if you saved in gold, you've done far better than if we're just buying treasury bonds, right? Because you have to think whether they say the CPI is 2% or 3% or whatever it is, what's the rate of monetary expansion? Well, how much more currency is being created? Well, 7 to 10%. Okay, well, that's your hurdle rate. Like whatever you're saving in needs to be able to beat that. And what do stocks do? Well, around 10%. Okay, you're treading water. You're not, and houses are growing faster, right? So that's, I think, the story people really need to understand is everything drops in relation to Bitcoin. Like everything gets cheaper related to Bitcoin. It's the ultimate tool to preserve not only your sovereignty, but also your purchasing power.
And on that note, besides your home, do you invest in other assets?
I do, yeah. So I still call myself a Bitcoiner, but I do invest in other Bitcoin proxies as well. So MicroStrategy is another company that I invest in. And it's funny, when I first heard Michael Saylor, of course, in my early orange pilling journey, I said to myself, how do I get long anything this guy's doing? Like, of course I need Bitcoin. Got to have cold storage Bitcoin. But how do I invest in anything? And I saw, he's head of MicroStrategy. I don't even know what they do. I just have to get some. And then the more I learned, of course, the more I kind of grew to invest in that. And then the other is Bitcoin miners. Bitcoin miners, cutthroat business that it is, they're fascinating. They're fascinating companies doing all kinds of things. Some pure play focused on mine Bitcoin for as low an energy cost as possible, right? And they're doing amazing things, like in Texas, how they help balance the grid, where if you have all of this flood of renewable energy, whether it's sun or wind, coming in during the day, well, nobody needs the energy at that time because they're all at work, right? And of course, there's commercial loads, right? But for homes, they're not using any of that energy. So it's just wasted. And so the Bitcoin miners can ramp up, soak up that energy, provide that base load demand, and really build the economics. And I already mentioned the gridless model. So I find miners fascinating and do invest some there. And that's really it. I got rid of all my altcoins. I'm not very interested in any of the other types of equities that one could invest in. Of course, not financial advice. This is just kind of how I've chosen to invest my own capital.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, what are some of the biggest lessons that Bitcoin has given you?
I think that's a really good question. It's done a few things, and I feel like I've seen other people make a similar journey. I think one, valuing high quality, and not just quality in terms of products, which I have seen Bitcoiners make phenomenal high quality products. I just bought some Christmas ornaments from somebody I just met on X that posted pictures, and I said, "I'll take it." And okay, here's your Lightning invoice. So I paid them in Bitcoin, right? And they're really well crafted ornaments for Christmas time. So quality is big, but it's not just about the products. It's also about myself and my food and all of those things that I bring into my home or into my body. So it got me looking at the quality of foods and seeing, all of the, in America, foods are full of, high fructose corn syrup and yellow number 5 and kind of all of these strange objects in our food. And so like many Bitcoiners, I've kind of gone down the carnivore route. Some people go the keto, pretty similar. Very few carbs so that I'm not getting, wheat that has, glyphosate and other things. And I pretty much gave up seed oils. So unless I can find tallow fried French fries, then I'm not having French fries. So it's changed, how I feed myself and my family. I happen to be the cook in my family. I have kids and a wife, and so they're eating, whether they like it or not, they're eating a pretty protein heavy, carb light diet. So it's changed that. It's made me, I think, even more curious. I was already a curious individual before, which is why emerging technologies was so interesting to me. And so now, as I mentioned before, I'm a reader. I've never was a reader. I wasn't very good in school, and I was kind of a late bloomer. Didn't attend college until my adult years, and then finally did do a bachelor's degree and a graduate degree, and was pretty good, but was never a reader. Now I'm a voracious reader. I'm reading like multiple books at a time. I've read I don't know, probably 7-8 books since I started this journey a year ago. So I'm not a fast reader. So yeah, I think it's really driven quality. It's driven me to be more curious. And then I think the aspect of community, I think I'll land on that, is also really, really critical. When you become a Bitcoiner, it can be kind of a lonely road. Like I've got a fellow that we somehow we met on X, and he mentioned how lonely he's been a Bitcoiner, I think, for a couple of cycles, and he mentioned how lonely it's been. So we started DMing back and forth, and I was trying to encourage him, and so we built a friendship, and we talk about our different trades and different things we're doing on with investments and things, but community, same thing. I encourage him, get plugged into a community somehow, right? I mentioned before, we're Christians, we have a church community, right? So we align on from a faith perspective. My family's very plugged in there. But on the Bitcoin side, eventually your spouse might get sick of hearing about it. So get into a community, right? The X community is great. Shout out to my, irresponsibly long, MSTR friends, and shout out to the Bitcoin mining mafia friends. And sometimes they fight. So I have to play peacemaker between those two groups, but it's so much fun to have all these friends. And I actually got to meet some of them in person at the Bitcoin conference, and I'll meet a bunch more next year in Vegas. So communities, so I think quality, I think curiosity, and I think community. Those are 3 things that Bitcoin's really enriched in my life.
Well, that's beautiful. I really like that answer. You mentioned that you paid in Bitcoin. And Jeff Booth always says that in order for Bitcoin to survive, it has to become a payments rail. Do you often use Bitcoin? Do you spend and replace? And what do you think about the payments rail side of Bitcoin?
This is a really, I feel, at least for me, a challenging question. And I think I agree. Jeff Booth does a really nice job, I think, framing it as just move yourself to that other world, right? Like I read his book Price of Tomorrow and have listened to many of his interviews. And he said, just put yourself all the way into that Bitcoin world. Stop trying to, straddle the fence. I'm still straddling the fence. And then Parker Lewis also has a good blog, and I haven't read the blog yet, but I listened to the podcast with Marty Bent on TFTC not too long ago, exchange value of Bitcoin and why it's important to spend on the rails. So I say all that as a little bit of background of, again, that curiosity. I'm trying to plug in and understand it. Generally, no. I generally still kind of more like the sailor thesis, right, of save in Bitcoin and spend in fiat. Right. And so that's generally been my approach with certain occasions where I'll buy things, in Bitcoin. When I bought the tickets to Bitcoin's conference, for example, there was a discount to buy in Bitcoin, and I bought it on Black Friday. So it was half off already, and I got the Bitcoin discount. So, it was heavily incentivized, right, to do so. When I picked up these Christmas ornaments, I just kind of didn't think about it. It was a pretty small amount. And so I thought that's not that big of a deal. But I had bought some. So I was just talking to a coworker of mine just the other day. We're both Bitcoiners, and I had mentioned though, when I was at the conference, there were some clothing products that I'd bought at the conference, at the Bitcoin conference, and they asked me if I wanted to pay in Bitcoin or fiat, and I said fiat, and she was disappointed. And I've been thinking about that ever since, and I did go ahead and pay in fiat, and I thought about that, and I've been thinking about that ever since, and I may need to revisit my approach, because you think about it, like when you pay somebody in Bitcoin, think about how much you're valuing them. Like you're parting with this asset that is finite, and when they take their finely crafted product and they give that to you, and then you're giving them this asset that's only going to appreciate in value relative to other assets. Like how much more can I show how much I appreciate the value they've given to me? Like there's hardly anything that you could do. What I haven't figured out is like, okay, how do I build a flywheel where I'm paying things out in Bitcoin, but also bringing Bitcoin in? Like I fiat mine, right? I have my fiat job and get paid in fiat. And of course I dollar cost average every week, but how could I do things? How could I give a value and exchange my value and get rewarded with Bitcoin? And that's kind of, I think, where my mind is trying to think more about that. Like, okay, how do I get more, like Jeff Booth is challenging me to get my feet in that Bitcoin world? Try to encourage like my people I pay products to, like my beef producer, right? My rancher. How do I pay her in Bitcoin? And then how do I maybe do things for people and say, hey, pay me in Bitcoin, right? Like that football star. So I've got to work. That's probably my next area of growth, is like, how do I start thinking about it not only as store of value, Bitcoin that is, and more also as possible medium of exchange. The tax consequences are part of the complication, right? Because in the U.S., it's essentially a taxable event every time you want to spend the Bitcoin. Now, again, an adoption thing that could change. That could change in a Trump administration in the U.S. Or I've heard suggestions of maybe $200 to $500 could be exempt from capital gains tax. So it could be something like you could buy a cup of coffee or some beef or whatever and not think about it. So, but that's kind of my next, I think, frontier that I'm thinking through.
Yeah, and I appreciate you going through that. I think it's something that many of us are trying to do. I just wanted to clarify what Jeff Booth says. He himself has moved over as much as possible. What he recommends to everybody else is just start moving a little more. And I did the same as you. I paid for the Bitcoin conference in Bitcoin, but I put the fiat money in and then paid.
Yeah. Okay.
So what I do is, because I still have a hard time spending Bitcoin, but I love that you said it creates a lot of value for what you're giving, and I am going to give some people gifts in Bitcoin to try to orange pill them, and especially people where I'm from in Zimbabwe, that I really feel they need it so much. They are struggling with that inflation, and they just have no reason to get Bitcoin. But if I give a gift, they're might accept it. But have you tried to orange pill family and friends? How's that going?
I'm not very good at it, I don't think. Maybe I started, of course, with my wife, right? To once I became aware of all of these things, and we have the hers, mine, and ours type of a approach. So we, most of our assets we share, but we have some, kind of side money that we can spend for what we like, and we've both bought Bitcoin, and so I guess I was successful with one. My kids as another. So they kind of are curious and what dad's curious about. and I'm talking about Bitcoin all the time. So they all have Bitcoin wallets, right, on their devices, and I offer for them to do chores and get paid in Bitcoin and things like that. And my son's taking me up on that. My daughter's less so, but so that's been successful. And then I actually asked in a meeting one time, I think at work I'd asked about what's our Bitcoin strategy. So I'm at least trying to get the message out. I'm not I guess what they call a toxic maximalist. Like I try to get people curious, or I try to ask questions, or I try to make comments about inflation. And so I try to talk about like what the things are that Bitcoin helps to solve, whether it's the loss of purchasing power, or when people are frustrated by the government and why are they spending all this money, and when people can't quite connect the dots between the money printer and kind of this centralized monetary policy that we have, and then seeing the explosion in costs of goods, and people can't quite connect the dots. I try to use those opportunities to ask questions and then inject, like, that's why you need probably a harder asset, right? The asset we have grows 10% a year. And so, so I try to do that. So hopefully I'll become more successful. I guess I've been somewhat successful, right? I've at least got my family on board. I'm working on my dad. He's not quite there. Another generation, but he's curious. He said he's asked his advisor about it. Okay, that's a good start. His advisor has a Bitcoin fund, so I'm like, okay, they'll probably steer him in the right direction. But yeah, not a huge hit rate.
Join the club.
Yeah.
So for our last question, what does freedom mean to you?
Freedom, really, if you think about it, freedom is the ability to live your life, as a sovereign individual, right? Freedom to me really means that I can raise my family in the faith that I have. It means that I can eat the food that I think is healthy for me. It means that I can, live out my dreams for myself and for my family, right? It means that I can travel and see the world and not be, stopped at the border and can't do this or can't do that, right? Freedom really means I can worship, I can live, and be, and really kind of fulfill my dreams. I think as a more kind of as a libertarian minded individual, I believe in the non-aggression principle, right? So when I say, freedom means that I can live out my dreams, those are dreams that they won't impact other people, right? These are dreams that I believe can take my family where I want to go, and eat the foods that we want, and get educated the way we want to be educated, and live out our faith authentically. I think those are really key things. And I think when you have a money that is, and it's like, what is money, right? Like, money is this water we swim in, like we need it for everything. When you have a money that's broken, that's really not working, how free can you be, right? I think about the next generation. I have friends and younger friends in our church and our community who would love to buy a house. I mean, no way. You can't do it, right? Because they have this broken money. And so those who have the means and the assets are going to gobble up as many assets as they can to increase their store of value, to get ahead of the money printer, to get ahead of that inflation. But now houses aren't a utility item that people need as a place to live. Now it's just where you put your money. Like, I used to wonder, like, why do the wealthy own 5 homes? That doesn't make any sense. It's store of value. That's where they're putting their money, because once they sell a business for $100 million, you got to put that money somewhere. You ain't going to put it in T-bills. You're going to put it in this asset that's appreciating at about the price of the money supply. And so when you have a broken money, I don't know how people can really live out their freedom. I think America we're not perfect. We've got a checkered history, like, many places. But it's supposed to be this place where you can be free, to, you can move up the social strata. There's no caste system. There's no, serfdom. Like, you should be able to just go from custodian to CEO, right? Do whatever you want, or business owner, or whatever it is. And, but if you have a broken money, it's almost like making a marathon runner divert them to the track, right? To the track and field, course. And it's filled with hurdles. Every 5 yards, there's a hurdle. And so you've got to work, and eventually you just get tired, right? And you just go around them, and you walk around, and I can't even run the race anymore. And I think that's what it feels like to me, a broken money does. And when you have perfect money, like you have with Bitcoin, you can be free. People can, like, dream. People can imagine, like, wow, what would, like, there were things that I had written off. My wife wants to build a mountain, cabin someday. And I've been trying to, like, set her expectations. Like, honey, it sounds like a really cool idea. Now we can dream about it. Now I'm like, what plans do you want? Like, what design are you thinking? That's freedom.
I love that you came back to Bitcoin. That is what it gives us. It gives us freedom, or at
Yeah.
least the chance. Thank you so much for joining me today. This was really fun.
My pleasure. Enjoyed the conversation. Thank you, Paula.